Okay. We should actually, start now. All right. We're gonna start. We're gonna kick off at the moment. Okay, just 11 o'clock. I think people out there would watch this live streaming through YouTube, and then I hope actually that we would enjoy this actual lecture series. Of course, it's called a lecture series, but mostly the style is more like a pre-discussion, about Graham Harman's, the works, and then his recent, idea about the world or some political issues and then social issues. And then today, we hope actually that we try to focus on kind of, more practical, the issues. And then we will take a kind of, actually the question and answer time through a live chat and on YouTube. So I actually introduced today's speaker, Graham Harman. I think we don't need actually to introduce him because he's quite already famous, and then he established his own field, so-called spectral realism. And then these days he actually developed very unique reading of content philosophy, object-oriented philosophy, or ontological actually philosophy. And then personally, I'm actually I was inspired, a lot from his work. And then I think his, the critique or some challenge, to such a content of philosophy is very actually, the meaningful and significant. He touched the forgotten, area of this or forgotten, topic, which was actually ignored, by many, the content philosophers. And since the Kant, and Hume, he actually go beyond the sort of, actually the very normative, sense of philosophy. And then that is very interesting. And then also even though it's still developing and it's still growing, but many people already, actually were attracted by, his argument. So today we're gonna actually discuss, the further, which he has been not yet actually discussed, the dealt with, the other people here. So now he actually the mostly spectral realism. It sounds like analytic philosophy, but his actually main field is content philosophy. And then as far as I understand, I know, he started his career from phenomenology, and then mostly his actually work is based on remodification of such a phenomenological the topic and then sort of subject. And then that's, I think, a kind of very innovative, reading of phenomenology. And then, he also the very, how can I say, just heretic reading of Heidegger. And I know that actually many Heidegger experts wouldn't like, that one, but I like it anyway. Actually, that is, the use of content philosophy, different use of content philosophy. And then he opened the way toward the kind of minor, the sense of the content of philosophy. I like it. So, all right. I think actually this is Graham Harman. All right. So say hello to him, and then I after my actually opening, and then my friend is Job Bradley, part of this organizer. He gonna actually give outline of Graham Harman's works, and of course everybody would know that. And then I know Graham would talk about today's book is a background, and then sort of it's not the kind of full explanation of the topic, but anyway, just he would give why he actually wrote this book, or based on the lecture. But anyway, just in those days, what kind of things actually he had. So all right, so I wanna the over to actually the Job.
Thank you, Taekwon. First of all, I'm just really just humbled that you spared your time to come and speak to us. It's a real privilege and a real luxury, really, you can say that. So Tai Quang said a great deal about you already, so I'll just try and add a few other things and then we can hear you to speak. But from my perspective, I think there are very few philosophers living today who've made a real intervention in the history of continental philosophy, and I think in the history of philosophy. And I think Graham Harman is one of those philosophers. And I know your work. I've for a long time now, I know you've been working on Quentin Meillassoux and working with Levi Bryant and Timothy Mawson and Ray Brazier and in this area that we know as speculative realism. And yeah, I know that you're a student of Alfonso Linguist, so perhaps I'm going to pick up on that later. But Graham is the author of over 20 books and several other edited works, so his oeuvre is considerable, and his great work is on Heidegger's tool being, and I think that's very kind of central to your philosophical endeavors. But you speak with great ease on Bruno Latour and Meillassoux and Lovecraft and the metaphysics of love, and you've been collaborating with Manuel Delanda and working on art and objects and aesthetics recently, and in this area of object-oriented architecture. So you can speak very comfortably about Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty and Levinas and Latour and Aristotle and the pre-Socratics and ancient philosophy. And those are the things that have been going around in my mind in the last few weeks while I've been on my bicycle listening to your lectures. So I'm very impressed, and it's great to have you here. So if you could possibly say something about your newish work on Artful Objects, that would be terrific.
Sure. This was not a book that I expected to exist. It came about by circumstance. Back in January of 2015, I was invited to give a couple of lectures in Stockholm. One was at the Museum of Modern Art there, and that was followed by a question and answer period in the gallery, which featured a show at that time by Charlie Ray, Katharina Fritsch, and I'm blanking on the most famous one, Jeff Koons. And so I answered questions in the presence of works by those three artists. On the same trip, I was asked to give a lecture at the Stockholm School of Economics. I think that was actually the first. That was before the same day of the art lecture, but before it. I don't think there's a transcript of the one at the Stockholm Institute of Economics, but they helped subsidize the publication and the editing of the work. And then somewhat to my surprise, a few months after the Stockholm Art Museum lecture, I received a transcript from them of the talk. And I said, are you planning to publish this? And they said, sure, once the budget allows, we'll publish it. And I said, all right. So I just went through and first of all, edited some things that the transcriber had misheard, and then also had to redo it to be readable, because of course, when you speak, it's very different from a written text. And so you have to go back through and make sure that it sounds like good written prose, even though that's not exactly what the lecture sounded like. And then there was also a transcript of the question period, and they even were able to track down the names of everyone who had posed questions. The 12 or so people who asked questions. So everyone's name is in there as a contributor. And so again, this was, I wasn't going to Stockholm expecting a book to come out of it, but it was an exceptional event in the sense of how large the crowd was, which I wasn't expecting. The editors talk about that in the preface. This was early 2015. So what had I just published? I had just published Bruno Latour, Reassembling the Political. That was the most recent book at the time. I was surprised by the number of people there. There was even an overflow room, I believe, and I was surprised by the enthusiasm of the whole event. It was kind of an exciting event. And then there was a nice kind of informal mixer afterwards in the bar of the museum. Two other strange things happened on this trip. I'll just add to add some color here. One was that my wife and I contracted a horrible virus. Others who have visited Stockholm have also spoken about this virus. It's something like a flu. And to this day, we have not shaken all the symptoms of it. There were several minor ear, nose, and throat symptoms that we haven't been able to shake. So this is a good example of how viruses can actually mess with your DNA. And of course, we're all concerned about COVID now, but I'm physically not the same person I was before then. Interestingly, not especially damaging or anything. It's just interesting that a virus can change your body permanently in some ways. The other odd thing that happened was when I was speaking at the Stockholm Institute of Economics, a woman slightly older than I am came and sat down next to me. And it turned out she went to my high school. And you have to understand, my high school is a tiny, tiny school in a town of 3,000 or 4,000 people in eastern Iowa. And I did not know this woman. She was older enough than I am that I didn't know her family name or anything. In fact, I've forgotten her name since. I've got to dig it up again. Turns out she's a professor of the humanities in Scandinavia somewhere. So that was a strange coincidence. I'd never heard of this person. We shared a lot of background, obviously, and there she was carrying on an academic career in a totally different part of the world. So I felt like she was a kindred spirit. We had both left a fairly small and confining environment and gone on to do something else. So it was one of the strangest random encounters I've ever had at a lecture. Other than the man in Estonia, who overheard me talking about Heidegger over the microphone. And so he came in and approached me and thought that I was talking about his great uncle, who was a journalist named Heidegger spelled differently. And I couldn't convince him that I was actually speaking about Heidegger, the German philosopher. Yeah. He was quite sure that I was speaking about his great uncle, the journalist. So that was another odd, once in a while these things happen, but anyway, I just added that for some ornamentation to this introduction.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Paul. Actually, I think audience would understand, how this book is come out, and then this very actually a little bit small book, but I think very condensed, the argument about your philosophy in general is a, object-oriented ontology. Mm-hmm. And then what actually interested me and what struck me and when reading this book, you try to extend your, ontology toward, the kind of a political, field. And then, of course, actually, you already discussed that one. But, my question is actually, I want to actually give you a question about actually my impression of this book. Mm-hmm. You want, to intervene the more practical issue, and through your own, actually the reformulation of such ontology. And then, but, if those people who are not really actually, well known about your work, they would be very curious why you actually, you talk about ontology and you talk about more metaphysical, the topic, but why do you actually suddenly, involved, or so why suddenly approach this kind of idea, the idea of practical, the problem. So could you actually give us, the more, explanation and including a recent interest?
Sure. One of the things I think that's useful about object-oriented ontology is that in principle, it's of relevance to any field you can think of, because OOO is about the distinction between objects and their relations. What constitutes an individual? Mm-hmm. When does an individual become a new individual by entering into relations? What's the relation of an object with its own qualities? Mm-hmm. And these are topics that crop up in almost every field, along with the difference between the continuous and the discrete, which is the book I'm writing at the moment for Penguin. Mm-hmm. So I like to think that I'm talking about issues general enough that they are relevant to pretty much everyone. So I'm also collaborating on a book with an archaeologist right now, Christopher Whitmore. And it turns out that there are some points of shared concern there. Art, of course, and then architecture, the biggest, because I now teach in an architecture school. My first architecture book is coming out in the spring, Architecture and Objects. There too, it was architects who approached me. They took an interest in my work, and I had to work very fast to become somewhat competent in their field. So this is a repeated experience for me. Some field takes an interest in my work. I all of a sudden have to learn the basics of that field as quickly as I can so that I can have conversations with them. And then we hope something fruitful comes out of these collaborations. And I enjoy this every time. It's a way to be a student over and over again. I got to learn architecture in middle age. It's not often that you get to learn a new field from scratch that way, or be hired by a field where you don't initially have any competence, and then you have to grow into the job. So I'm always on the lookout for new possible pieces of relevance. I actually haven't done that much with economics yet, although it's on my radar. And they were half involved with this invitation along with the art museum. And so they just asked me questions about that at the Institute of Economics, and I tried to answer them as best I can. But obviously economics is of interest because it has to do with translation of one thing into the value of another thing, and translation is one of the major concepts of O.
All right. They're open to actually question. More question?
Okay. Shall I?
Sure.
Yep. Thanks, Professor Harman, for being here with us. And I'm quite excited also. From what I've read of you and the recent lectures that you gave, what I found your own problematic is about the surplus of the object. And that is where you kind of build up your whole theoretical structure. You bring in Timothy Morton, dark ecology. You kind of go away from Latour because Latour can't address the question of the surplus of the object, though you kind of take from him the concept of actant or critically, but focusing on the object side. I also think that Latour is a break in anthropology because I've worked on the interface of both anthropology and philosophy. So in terms of, like, as you said, when you introduced the question of object, so there could be some sort of reductionism. As you said, like in terms of on the basis of value, you can analyze the object, which was predominantly done in the discipline of economic anthropology, or even in Marxism, Marxist schools, or other materialist school associated with Marxism. Beyond that, you retained a concept of, like, in a way, retained the concept of thing in itself also, not avoiding the human subject there, like that is where you come to the question of essence and going back to Heidegger. My first question to you would be, like, is there any structure, any epistemological structure to understand the essence of the object? Like, is there any? So far, it's clear for me, but where to go beyond that?
I heard either a parrot or a gecko in the background. What was that?
Oh, that is the calling bell.
There's always situation, everyday, daily situation in India.
Yes. Well, first of all, I'm on record as saying I think Bruno Latour is one of the greats. I can never repay what I learned from him. And there's a lot to be learned from him. His critique of modernism, his flat ontology, in the sense that he treats all objects as equally, or actors as he calls them, as equally relevant to a situation. You just have to follow what the actors are doing. There's also his big systematic late work, inquiry into modes of existence, which not many people know what to do with yet. But there's an economic connection there because 3 of his modes are generated by decomposing economics, which he thinks is a false mode, a false crossing of attachment, organization, and morality. So economics is also central for Latour for the same way. He's trying to talk about what cannot be translated economically. There are at least 3 kinds of aspects to a thing that cannot be translated that way. And this interests me very much too. I've tried to stay away from saying anything premature about Marxism because so many people are so attached to that right now. And it's not the kind of debate you want to jump into lightly, where everyone already has staked out their position. So I'm going kind of slowly on that front, but I think eventually you're going to see me write something about economics maybe over the next decade or so, once I feel a little more sure about exactly what I want to say about it. But the sword's already there. As for the human subject, we don't want to erase the human subject. That would be the position of Ray Brassier, right? Who thinks that by getting rid of humans, you get closer to reality. Eugene Thacker also has that aspect. What about the world after humans are gone? And even Meillassoux, right? Because he wants, when he talks about the ancestral realm or the diachronic realm, he wants to talk about the world before humans exist or after we're extinct. And that's not the sense of the thing in itself that interests me. I'm interested in the thing in itself here and now. Humans are here now, but we still can't get the thing in itself. So for me, reality isn't something that predates or exists after the human species. It's something that's here, but outside of our grasp. And that, in that sense, it's a surplus, yes. It's something that any human knowledge of, perception of, or practical use of anything is going to be a model of that which it encounters. And so it's a problem of translation there. There is never going to be an equivalence between our idea of something and the thing. And some people say, well, that's obvious. Obviously, there's a difference between someone's mathematical model of a dog and an actual dog. But the question is whether or not they address that problem sufficiently. Because if you were to ask Meillassoux, for example, since you think the primary qualities of things can be mathematized, what's the difference between a mathematical model of a dog and the actual dog? The answer he would give you is the real dog inheres in dead matter. And then we somehow extract the primary qualities of the thing and make a mathematical model of it. That's an incredibly conservative position. If you contrast it with the whole history of philosophy, it's like something from St. Thomas Aquinas or certain disciples of Aristotle, that we somehow extract a form from matter and bring it into the mind. Well, the problem is no one has ever heard of this or seen this thing called matter. This idea of matter is something that is postulated simply to explain why some things hurt when we bump into them, and also to explain why an idea is not the same as the thing that the idea is about. I'm more of the school that you find in some of the scholastics that you cannot move a form without translating it. So already the idea of the dog in my mind is different in form from the form in the dog itself. It's not just that one is in matter and the other is not. I don't recognize the existence of matter. I think it's a very troubled traditional concept that has no good reason to exist, which is why I'm suspicious of the new materialisms, even though we have some things in common. For me, everything's about form. And the reason my idea of a chair doesn't make a scratch on the floor, but the real chair does, is because they have different forms. They have different parts. And since they have different parts, they have different forms. My idea of a chair is made of the visual parts that exist in my brain that I'm arranging in a certain way. The chair itself is made of parts that are very different from my idea of it. So that's the sense in which I approach translation, that the world consists in forms, and the forms are always translated when they go from one place to the next. And this has a lot of exciting possible implications. For example, Kant's treatment of the ontological proof for the existence of God, right? My idea of 100 real crowns contains nothing that is not in the 100 possible crowns. I think Kant is wrong about that. The 100 real crowns do have much in the way of qualities that are contained in not contained in the idea of the 100 crowns. So I think we'd have to do it differently from how Kant did it. But these are all research projects I haven't had time to start yet. They're just thoughts that occur to me as I'm trying to apply O throughout the history of philosophy.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, you very clarified, your position against, other so-called speculative realists. But actually, these days, it doesn't look, they are still devoted to speculative realism. They develop their own, the philosophy. But you actually clarify your position and then made the difference. So, yeah.
Yes, it remains to be seen what Meillassoux' new position is going to look like. I've heard that he's not planning to publish the full text of Divine in Existence anymore, that he may be going in a different direction, but that's hearsay. Brassier already went somewhat in a different direction. At the beginning of speculative realism, he was sort of doing a balancing act between contemporary French philosophy and the natural sciences. Since then, he's gone more and more towards the natural sciences. He's almost like an analytic philosopher now, which is somewhat different from what he was in 2007. And Ian Hamilton Grant did the book with his colleagues on idealism, and I'm not sure what his current project is. Triple O also continues to change. And partly that's just by expanding, by picking up new topics. But then once in a while, there may be a book where totally new topics are introduced. And you mentioned immaterialism. That's one of those books. When I talk about symbiosis, that was my attempt to take Triple O into the arena of social philosophy.
All right. So actually, getting back to your actually the current interest in, and then also the based on the one you said, actually according to your discussion, actually, the architecture, and then as far as I know, actually politics, and then art, all these things is kind of illusion of the object, and then if you said, and then actually your answer to Manoj's question reminds me of kind of, a little bit very phenomenological, actually the framework. You already talk about the form, and then, so how could you actually make difference between your own idea and then, such a phenomenological actually presupposition?
The phenomenological school was where I came from, as you correctly noted.
Yeah.
I actually had an interest in Husserl first before I got into Heidegger full bore. And the main difference actually is that I think I am trying to combine what Husserl and Heidegger did. In the quadruple object, when I talk about two axes, there are lots of fourfold structures throughout the history of philosophy, and they're not all the same. What they all have in common is that they're taking two dualisms and combining them. If you do that, you're going to get a fourfold structure. You find that in linguistics or in psychoanalysis or anywhere where two dualisms are considered to be the most basic ones. In the case of Triple O, obviously the basic one is the Heideggerian one, where you have being, you have that which withdraws, contrasted with that which is present at hand or directly accessible. And that's usually the only one people talk about when they talk about Triple O. But the other one is just as important, and that's the one that I get from Husserl, which is the idea that, well, everything's phenomenally accessible because there are no things in themselves, as Kant thought. There's nothing in the world that isn't potentially the object of an intentional act by the mind. And so I would consider Husserl an idealist for that reason, but it doesn't matter, but because that very idealism is what enables him to see the crucial difference between the object and its unity and its multiplicity of traits or qualities. And you can find forerunners of this, of course, in the history of philosophy. The existence-essence distinction is somewhat related, because the existence of a thing pertains to its unity and its essence pertains to its plurality of characteristics or qualities. And then I've tried to show that in the early Heidegger, there's some awareness of these two dualisms, but Heidegger gives that up, and it never really appears again in his philosophy as a direct commentary on Husserl. So what Husserl gives us is the idea that unlike what David Hume and the empiricists say, an apple is not a bundle of qualities. An apple is a unified thing that shows different qualities at different times. And as you're turning the apple in your hand or tasting it or thinking about it or seeing it in different lighting conditions, you're never saying to yourself, oh, this is very similar to the previous apple. It's 98.4% similar, and therefore I will arbitrarily call it the same bundle. And I will call it a member of, I will say that it has a family resemblance with the earlier apple. No, that's not what happens mentally for us. We say, oh, this is the same apple, and I'm seeing it from different sides. We know that all the different sides of the apple you can see are inessential. They're Abschattungen, they're adumbrations. You're supposed to scrape them away to get at the essence. And yet the apple itself in its unity is given because I retain my focus on that apple throughout all the changes in its qualities. And Husserl, as far as I can tell, is really the only person since the British empiricists to openly challenge that doctrine of the object as a bundle of qualities. Many people fail to. Kant gets pretty close because Kant talks about the transcendental object equals X, as opposed to the thing in itself. The thing in itself is the withdrawn and hidden one. The transcendental object equals X for Kant is not a hidden one. It's different from the thing in itself. It's there in our perceptions, but he says it's just the empty form of thought. So that's where he falls short of seeing that, no, it's actually a real unity, as Husserl sees. Brentano, Husserl's teacher, doesn't get to this insight. He tends to think of objects in terms of bundles of qualities. I just finished an article on Slavoj Žižek where I said the same about Žižek. This difference between an object and its qualities are missing in Žižek. They're missing in Badiou. All of these people are implicitly bundle theorists in the way of British empiricism, and Hume especially. And so Husserl had this insight that is probably the key to his philosophy that is seldom discussed even by Husserlians. And so in a way, Triple O is trying to combine those two. And that's where we get the fourfold structure that's the basis for all of Triple O. Real objects, real qualities. Sensual objects, sensual qualities. Objects and qualities always come as a pair, but there are four possible kinds of combinations. You can have a real object with real and sensual qualities. You can have a sensual object with real and sensual qualities. And you can get a lot of mileage philosophically out of just looking at the mechanics of how those work. And then I talk a lot about metaphor, because metaphor, I think, is one of the primary ways in which objects lose their qualities and gain the qualities of other objects by a kind of transference. And then, of course, that immediately gets us in the territory of psychoanalysis, which is dependent on the notions of metaphor and metonymy through Freud's work on dreams. And so through a relatively small number of simple concepts, Triple O is able to pop up almost anywhere and be somewhat useful to just about any fields.
Yeah, actually, anybody intervene? Okay, Chof.
Yeah, I was thinking about what you said, and I was thinking about what the late British scientist Stephen Hawking said about philosophy is dead, because philosophy is can no longer answer epistemological questions. So I was thinking about your response, what your response might be to someone like Stephen Hawking, and I guess, as you mentioned yourself, then what about the question of apodictic knowledge? And is there something always eluding absolute knowledge of the object? I think your argument is that aesthetics, because you just mentioned metaphor then. So aesthetics would be that something that eludes a kind of a summary, a summation. So I guess, I mean, I would like to hear something about the way that you use aesthetics as that kind of surplus, as Manoji said. And when I was thinking about this, so there would be like a question of the phenomenology of allure or something, the object, something that kind of draws you into the object. And that brought me back to Linguist and the question of sensation. So I guess your argument is that aesthetics, just as a shorthand, from what I understand, your argument is that kind of aesthetics would be first philosophy, and it's not ethics in that sense, but a kind of a general theory of substance and what you call vicarious causation. So a theory of substance and causation. And then from that, I got all these ideas from Linguist, all the language of the imperative and the levels and directives from the object. So I was wondering about the influence of Linguist, because you said that Latour was a profound influence on you.
Yes.
But
Linguist was, go ahead.
No, but then I had this, just last night on the way back from work, I was thinking about this, thinking about Linguist and your work, and the kind of ethical force of an object. And it's not so much the humans that the kind of objects, objects they kind of manifest imperatives, right? And they don't need humans as such for that. There can be an imperative between objects, I guess. And then this is what I want to really say, is that I was listening to Linguist on the way back from work last night, and then he mentions this idea of an effective self-consciousness. And he was talking about the hammer, and the hammer, and you know, it's very kind of a Heideggerian tool analysis, and somehow the hammer wants to be kind of held in a particular way, but he says it's not like an intuitive awareness of it or a conceptual awareness, but it's an affective awareness. So I guess my thought was that, what is this affective self-consciousness of the object? And over the last couple of weeks, I heard in one of your talks the idea of that objects have minds. And I wonder if that is the same thing in some way. And then that would mean that there is a real influence of linguists there in your work. Would I be right in that?
Absolutely right. And I can start with the linguist question. You asked three very good questions there. Linguist was my earlier mentor. He was my master's degree supervisor. So it was before I even knew who Bruno Latour was. And Linguist, of course, for those who know him, is a tremendously charismatic personality and writer. Possibly one of the best writers of his generation in the world. Fantastic style. And you mentioned the book, The Imperative. I was one of the earliest readers of that book when he had it in manuscript form. We've always stayed pretty close since I left Penn State when he was there. Maybe I should first say the element of linguist in my current position, he's actually partly responsible for it. When I wrote my master's paper for him, it was on Heidegger's tool analysis and a bit of Levinas, who I was reading for the first time there, since he's the notable English translator of Levinas. And that was still a pre-Triple O piece of writing, in the sense that I was taking Heidegger's line, the system of tools is holistic, and that there aren't any individual tools until they break, and this sort of thing. And Linguist pushed back on that. This was back in 1991. He pushed back on that and said, he wonders if that's really true. And he made a case against the holism of the tool system, right? That the individual tools already have a certain self-containedness that allows them to break. And he cited Levinas for that. That Levinas, in a way, is one of the surprising contemporary defenders of substance, right? That substance, the thing as substance comes before thing as function. That's one of Levinas's several critiques of Heidegger. And Linguist transformed that into an article on the phenomenology of substance. That's one of his most underrated pieces, isn't read enough. It's from the Catholic Philosophical Quarterly from, I don't remember exactly when, probably the 1990s. So yes, that's one aspect of Linguist influencing me, along with the fact that he's simply an outstanding writer and his work ethic as a writer. Linguist was very generous, and so his starving graduate students would often be put up in his hotel room during conferences. And those of us who had that experience got the experience of him waking up at 5 a.m. and typing for 3 hours. That's a rigorous ritual to which he holds himself every day. And he produces thousands of pages of writing that way. So yeah, people think of him as a colorful character. They don't think of him as a hard worker, but that's what he is. He's a very hard worker. In terms of the imperative, yes, the idea that inanimate things can have an ethical imperative over us, that it's wrong to take a fine wine and chug it down and eat a McDonald's hamburger with it. There's something ethically wrong about this. He even applies this to Merleau-Ponty. He says there's an imperative in having to see objects as being straight up and down, even though your head is very rarely straight up and down. And so the visual field is usually askew in some way, but you correct that by means of an imperative to see the objects themselves as straight up and down. So he found the imperative at work in a lot of different places. And I still keep in touch with Linguist to this day. A fascinating human character, and really one of the best writers you're ever going to meet, whether in philosophy or literature or any fields. The man can write. Okay, now you were asking about aesthetics, his first philosophy. Here's what I would say about that. Triple O is in part, not in part, largely opposed to the idea of literalism as the model for experience. Literalism means that a thing can be replaced by a given set of qualities that can accurately be said to belong to that thing. So you can give a literal definition of an apple or a horse by just defining the qualities it has. And so then the true proposition as an analytic philosophy becomes the shining example of the philosophical statements. You've made congratulations, you've stated a true proposition. For Triple O, this is minor, relatively, or not minor, maybe not minor, but at best, half of human cognition. Human cognition is not primarily about knowledge. Knowledge always involves either reducing a thing downward or reducing it upwards. If someone asks you what a thing is, you can say what it's made of, or you can say what it does. I challenge you to find another kind of knowledge from those two. There aren't, because I've thought about this a lot. Every kind of knowledge either involves talking about what a thing is made of or what it does. Neither of those really gives the thing itself, because both of those things are relational. The thing itself is more than its parts and less than its effects, because it's capable of having other effects than the ones it has now. So that's the first clue to the idea that aesthetics, something special was going on with aesthetics. And I then began to treat aesthetics as a separation between a real object and its sensual qualities. That an art object is never directly visible. An art object is a mysterious, inaccessible object that is orbited by accessible qualities that belong to that real object that we can't access in some not quite perfectly known way. And so the metaphorical statement or the aesthetic statements or the aesthetic object creates a rift in the object itself between its objecthood and its qualities, whereas literal objects never do that. If I say a pen is like a pencil, that's not a metaphor. I'm just making a statement that these two objects have many similar qualities. They have a similar shape and a similar function. They can both be used for writing, even if one is ink and the other is graphite. Okay, well, that's not really a metaphorical statement. And neither is a statement metaphorical if the two terms are too far apart. Like I once heard, drinking a milkshake is like drawing an isosceles triangle. That might be made to work by some genius Dadaist poets, but it doesn't really work for most of us. It doesn't sound metaphorical. The comparison is too much of a stretch. But then if you look at Ortega's example that I use a lot, the cypress tree is like the ghost of a dead flame. They have a certain superficial similarity, which is the shape of both. And on the basis of that shape similarity, a statement is made that the cypress and the flame are identical, which is impossible, but it creates this beautiful aesthetic effect where you're imagining this absent magical cypress tree that is orbited by these flaming qualities. Here's another difference between metaphorical and literal statements. Literal statements are always reversible. You can say a pen is like a pencil or a pencil is like a pen. It doesn't make a difference. Both mean the same thing. But you can't use Homer's metaphor of the Mediterranean as a wine dark sea, and then also talk of a sea dark wine. Those are both metaphors, but sea dark wine is different from wine dark sea. Sea dark wine is a wine. The wine dark sea is a sea. So they're irreversible as well. So they're irreversible. They cannot be made literal. And they also can't be too close together or too far apart. Those are some of the characteristics of metaphorical statements. Now, knowledge, of course, is necessary for the human species. So I'm not saying knowledge is worthless. I'm just saying knowledge and aesthetic statement cannot be mutually convertible. Just like you can't convert a three-dimensional globe into a two-dimensional map. It's impossible. It is mathematically impossible to take a three-dimensional surface and make it two-dimensional without distorting the size or shape of the surfaces on it. The same with metaphor and literal statement. Literary critics have known for a long time that you can't literalize a metaphor. You can't cash it out in terms of literal truths. In literary criticism, this has been noticed at least as early as the new critics of the 1940s, like Cleanth Brooks and that circle of American critics. In philosophy, Max Black, the analytic philosopher in the 60s, wrote a very influential essay about how you can't turn a metaphorical statement into any literal equivalent. The more you comment on the metaphor, the more you're going to need to use metaphors to explain the metaphor. And so aesthetic language is a very different type of thing from literal language. Now, literal language has a lot to do with what we call knowledge and what we call science. You're replacing a proper name by a set of qualities that are said to belong to that proper name. Here's where it gets interesting. Because usually philosophers like to say that knowledge is justified true belief. That's the most famous definition. I claim that you can't have something that's justified and true at the same time. I say that knowledge is what's justified. Science is what's justified, in the sense that if you listen to scientists talk, they can't talk about what they think is true. They can only talk about what we can justify given the present state of experimentation and theory. The scientific theories of today will turn out to be wrong. We're almost positive of that, right? Because we know that relativity and quantum theory are inconsistent with each other. We know there's no explanation for dark matter or dark energy yet. So the successful physics of the future will show that Einstein and quantum theory were wrong about important things. And any scientist you talk to will admit that. They have to. And so they have to admit that what they're doing in science isn't true. It's not a perfect match for reality. It's simply justified. It's the best that we can say based on knowledge. Whereas some crackpot could randomly say something and it could turn out to be true 200 years from now. But we're not going to call them great scientists because they got it by luck, or they got it without proper justification. So knowledge is all about justification. And this is why, Popper and Lakatos, his heterodox disciple, both talk about the progress of science as occurring through falsifications, not through supporting evidence so much. Lakatos is a little different, but Popper makes that statement pretty clearly. And so what they're saying essentially is that science is never true. A scientific statement is that which is going to turn out not to be true eventually. So we have to stop associating science with truth, where it should be associated with justification. Now, philosophy is different. I would put philosophy in the same corner as art here, where you can have a true experience that's not justified. And that would be something like an immediate personal experience of the sort that Kierkegaard talks about, a wager or a decision that you make. It might not be totally unjustified. You have one of these experiences rather than another, but ultimately you have to make a choice. Now, Alain Badiou calls this the anti-philosophical tradition, as opposed to the philosophical. He thinks they're very close to each other. The anti-philosophical tradition includes people like Heraclitus and Nietzsche and Pascal and Kierkegaard and Wittgenstein and Nietzsche, people who are known largely for being critics of academic philosophy in one way or another, usually have one particular academic philosopher they oppose, like for Kierkegaard, it's Hegel, for Pascal, it's Descartes, and so on. For Nietzsche, it's maybe Kant, maybe Schopenhauer, depending on how you look at it. And so those are what we call true experiences, where you realize something is true, and you may not be able to prove it using reasoned justifications to everyone, but it's true enough that you're willing to devote yourself to it. As Badiou discusses with events, right? That in order for a political revolution to be real, people have to remain faithful to it as a real event. Or I suppose if you're in psychoanalysis, the psychoanalyst might say something about you that you know is true and that just blows you away because you've never thought of yourself in those terms before. And you just think, wow. And I can't explain this to anyone but myself because only I know the saga I've been through since the Oedipal stage in childhood. But wow, that really gets me. Now I know who I am. That's a truth. So a truth and a justified statement are actually opposites. The truth should be something that's immediately apparent as soon as you see it or hear it. And I put philosophy a little more on the side of truth. It obviously has justifications as well. Philosophy, I don't believe in unsystematic philosophy, like certain period Nietzsche or Paul Ray. I think in philosophy, truths have to be connected somehow. But I also think this. I think philosophy goes astray when people think it's my job as a philosopher to have a position on absolutely every issue, that I will make a statement. Linguist complained about one of his colleagues who was like this, that one of his students would say, what do you think about muscles? That was the random topic Linguist mentioned. And this professor would say exactly what he thinks about muscles, which is kind of silly because, Linguist is a bodybuilder, so he actually has some thoughts about muscles. This other guy is just an academic philosopher. He's probably never thought about muscles in his life. He doesn't have a philosophy of it. And so I'm of the opinion that you build a philosophy out of paradoxes, not out of unshakable first truths, the way Descartes or Kant wants us to do, or Husserl. You take the things that strike you as paradoxical and you build your philosophy out of that. And in my case, that was Heidegger's tool analysis, which took me a long time to figure out. Or Ortega y Gasset's essay on metaphor, which took me 18 years to figure out. That's my personal record, I think, for slowness. But because that paradox was there at the core, it's like having the black hole at the center of the galaxy that can all rotate around it. If there's a philosophical paradox that really means something to you personally, that's the best place to start your philosophical work. Don't look for an irrefutable first truth because I don't think there are any. That's what geometry starts with, and they're axioms. They're not provable anyway. I don't think you start with it. You could start a philosophy anywhere. What matters is where you end up. The other question Joff asked was about Hawking, and I'll try to keep this answer short, but I have two opposing thoughts about Hawking. On the one hand, of course, I rise to the defense of philosophy and say, Hawking's using philosophical concepts in his science, so he's not as innocent as he thinks he is. And I wrote an article defending philosophy against Hawking. But there is a grain of truth in what he says. And I think that grain of truth is that people are excited about science right now because it talks about objects. It doesn't just talk about the human world relation, which is what philosophy has been reduced to, thanks to the Kantian tradition in both continental and analytic branches. Physics promises to talk about really strange things like black holes and dark energy. It tries to give answers to ultimate questions we care about, like how did the universe begin? How will it end? It has a series of basic concepts that anyone can contribute to trying to solve as a puzzle. The article that excited me most as a high schooler was an article in, I think it was in the Atlantic, maybe it was the New Republic magazine, about the way the electroweak unification happened in physics in the early 70s. The way the electromagnetic force was unified with the weak nuclear force. And that was fascinating because they faced the fact that they had a paradox, that they're trying to unify all the four forces, and they still have a unified gravity, but they thought there might be a way to unify electromagnetism and the weak force. And they pursued it, and there were some mathematical anomalies that showed up, and somebody solved those. And it was a kind of teamwork because they were all chasing the same object. And finally, 3 people shared the Nobel Prize for it, who were very different characters. There was Abdus Salam from Pakistan, and then Weinberg and Glashow, 2 very different characters from the United States, who all contributed to the electroweak theory in some way. So we don't really have anything like that in philosophy. Yes, there might be shared research programs in analytic philosophy, but that doesn't really happen in the continental branch so much. Continental branch is a kind of hero worshiping branch, and I'm part of this branch, so I don't say that critically. Analytic philosophy has the upside that people don't get intimidated by the great figures they're studying. In principle, a graduate student can find a flaw in Plato's arguments and improve them in analytic philosophy. In continental philosophy, that would be considered insane, right? Plato is this great genius you can't dare to equal. And that in itself is a negative aspect, I think. But the positive side of it is that people spend a lot of time learning the great figures and not just reducing them to true and false arguments. And so there's good and bad with both traditions. People talk about bridging between the two. I don't think that's what should happen. I think they should both be abandoned, and a third one should start, because I think they both share the same flawed starting point in Kant. The idea that philosophy is about starting with the human world relationship and how do we reason our way out of that to talk about other stuff. And in practice, we let natural science talk about all the other stuff. If you want to talk about, or if I want to talk about fire burning cotton from the Islamic philosophical tradition, people claim that chemistry can explain that. Well, yes and no. Chemistry can explain a fire burning cotton in terms of the physics and chemistry of burning. It can't explain the metaphysical problem of how do the two touch. So I think I will defend philosophy against all the physicists, including Hawking. And the more open-minded physicists are very interested in philosophy. You know, Einstein and Bohr. The kind of anti-intellectual scientist is a sort of Anglo-American invention, right? It's Feynman and these people and his followers who don't want to speculate philosophically. What's the one interpretation of the quantum theory? Shut up and calculate, meaning it works. Who cares what the philosophical meaning of it is? That was never going to satisfy Niels Bohr, and I think we need more of Niels Bohr's spirit ahead.
All right, so yeah, the fantastic discussion about over that job the questions, and then I also have another question. But anyway, just I think it's Chunmei actually this time Chunmei already wrote the article about Graham's work, and then would you have some question and discussion?
That article actually is not about triple O, it's about Anthropocene feminism. But I actually want to follow Joe's questions about the artful object. Actually, the difference between artful object and any other kind of object. And I was thinking that why I love philosophy. I'm not in philosophy, I'm in sociology, but I'm always troubled by the need to defend a discipline, be it philosophy or sociology or I don't know, any discipline. But of course, philosophy can be more than a discipline, right? But so for me, there are so many aspects of the definition, and every definition, for me, this is my way of understanding it. I think definition is actually about translating, you know. So somehow we can, and we are already doing it all the time, like especially in this century, we see all kind of efforts of translating the so-called scientific objects into artful objects, or vice versa, you know. So, and one of the charm of Triple O is about, okay, the elusive character of object, right? And I remember, because I was reading your work on art and object, and your definition of artwork is that it's unparaphrasable, right? It's not literal. But and I got confused, because for me, nothing is literal. Even this scientific object or any scientific statement is not literal in the absolute sense. There is always something metaphorical, something narrative, you know, some metaphorical narrative in that seemingly literal statement of science. Now, and this point also relates actually what you just said about science. In a sense, proves that science is not literal. You know, it's more than that. So, like in quantum physics or in molecular biology, or you know, in contemporary sciences, life sciences especially, when an object reveals itself to us, it also simultaneously conceals or reveals how much we don't know about it. And maybe we will never know the whole picture. And I think this is the prominent character of contemporary science. It's more and more, you know, the science we are seeing now is, in a sense, more like turning back to the science in the traditional sense, and more like art in a sense, and even more like what you said, philosophy, especially Socratic philosophy, which is like science, like art, as you said, unparaphrasable. Right? That's what we see in the modern or modern contemporary scientific object. So that this my not exactly a precise question, but my confusion about all this talk about all this, that for me it's all about politics of boundaries. You know, like we are always trying to walk a more that's precise line between science, philosophy, and art, but that boundaries or those lines are keeping flowing or something. So maybe that's also about the elusive character of not only object, but also boundaries between objects.
Okay. Yeah, interesting what you say about science and art in particular, because I just meant science in the way it's commonly imagined, which is making true statements on the basis of experiments. because obviously art can also become literal in some ways, and likewise science can become aesthetic. In fact, Zizek has this funny statement he made about the reversal of science and art in contemporary times. You're not going to find an artist today, or not many, talking about beauty. That's considered a very old-fashioned and naive concept. It's going to be people writing books about string theory who talk about how beautiful the universe is or how beautiful the DNA molecule is. Scientists love talking about beauty. Artists and architects, not so much. And science is supposed to deal with reality, but it's artists who are giving us brute reality now, like Damien Hirst putting a dead cow in a cage and flies are coming in to eat the dead cow and being electrocuted. That's art now, right? That's brute reality rather than beauty. And so in a way, they've reversed their stereotypical qualities in a sense. But I could also mention here Thomas Kuhn, that Kuhn draws a famous distinction between paradigm shifting and normal science, right? That normal science, which is 90-some% of the science, involves puzzle solving on the basis of an assumed paradigm. So everyone assumes Einstein's relativity is right, and now you have to solve some puzzles that are anomalous within Einstein's framework. Whereas the paradigm shift will come when someone improves Einstein's theory of gravity and gives a quantum theory of gravity. And one way I read the difference between paradigm shifting and normal science is the difference between objects and qualities. In the case of paradigm shifting science, the scientific object changes. So that when Newton made his theory, universal gravitation was a new object whose qualities weren't all entirely known. Even Newton didn't know how it would be possible for gravity to work at infinite speed at a distance, which Einstein later showed is impossible. And the same with Einstein. Einstein's objects, such as curving space and time, are so strange that it's hard to literalize those. Right? It takes a lot of thought experiments and reading many books to be able to make any sense of Einstein, and even more so of quantum theory. And so you get these theories that are strange enough that they are very aesthetic in their own way. And even in higher mathematics, you would think that mathematics would be the most paraphrasable subject of all, because you can put anything in an equation. And yet there is something hauntingly beautiful about higher mathematics, and mathematicians are another group that will often talk about beauty. Right? Mathematicians talk about this book that exists in heaven that contains the most elegant proof of every possible truth. And if somebody comes up with an especially elegant proof, they'll say that one's from the book. It's from the book of God. Whereas, for example, Andrew Wiles' solution of Fermat's last theorem, although it works, is not that elegant, right? It takes up 300 pages and it's using all these conic sections that seem to have nothing to do with, or curves. He had to go way out of his way. Fermat must have had a much simpler and more elegant solution to it. But the point being that you can find aesthetic phenomena anywhere. I didn't mean to say so narrowly or rigidly that beauty belongs only to the humanities and to philosophy, and exactitude and justification belong only to the sciences. Just that's, I'd say the majority of the time that's the case, that science works more in the medium of true propositions that are justifiable, and the humanities work more in the sense of immediate understanding, trying to identify with the enigmatic subject of a biography or figure out an art or architectural work. And this itself isn't new, right? The difference between understanding and explanation goes at least back to Max Weber, or around then. So this is not an idea that has to be created new out of whole cloth. There have been steps along the way about the differences between the way the sciences usually work and the way the humanities usually work. Part of what, if I get defensive about it, probably part of why that is that science still very much has the upper hand in our culture. Anything that's exact is considered somehow more rational. And what really pushed my button was Thomas Metzinger, the neurophilosopher, who thinks that eventually all metaphysical problems can be solved by neurophysiological discoveries. And he wrote that book, The Ego Tunnel, where he has a chapter that's an interview with Wolf-Singer, another neuro guy. And Wolf-Singer says something in there that just made me facepalm, where he said, yes, neuroscience is going to replace philosophy, but don't worry, philosophers, we're still going to need you to sit on ethics panels. And I used to chair an ethics panel. I'm not contemptuous at all of ethics panels. But the idea that that's all philosophy is good for is, for me, the final reduction to absurdity of the notion that all humans can talk about is the human world relation, that we have nothing to say about objects or the non-human universe. I think philosophy can talk about the world, but simply in a different way than the sciences. The sciences talk about the world insofar as it's mathematizable and talks about the location of things in space-time. There are other ways to talk about the world than that, though. And that's something philosophy can do, like the way things hide, the way things can exchange qualities. These are things that physics will have a harder time talking about than philosophy, because physics is dealing with one particular level of things, the ultimate physical particles or fields of things, whereas philosophy can deal with many different emergent levels of reality.
So actually, the job.
Is it okay?
Me first.
No,
Actually,
me first.
adding on,
My thought's going to go away.
the role of philosophy. Yeah, actually, it's a very quick comment. Of course, yes. Actually, I agree that actually, and then thing is that, all right, after the Second World War, actually, when you think about talking about the actual role of philosophy is against the science, and then in particular in economics, and then many social science, and then actually lots of French philosophers, including Deleuze, and then those Foucault, and then they try to revive such a metaphysical tradition, to the limit, the extension of a scientific discourse, or some, as you said, a kind of scientific dominance actually over all kind of human the field. So I think that it doesn't mean actually they try to reject the science, but the locate science in proper place. That is exactly that's why the revival of Bergson, and then the Nietzsche, and then many actually philosophers is came on the stage. But as for that kind of history, I think you clarified your the position, and then your idea about the philosophy. That is very, actually, in my opinion, very agreeable, actually, the presupposition. But what about your triple O, actually the role? What I mean, actually, in this tradition, that means you actually clarify you belong to this tradition, the try to bring in, the sort of actually the place of philosophy in the middle of this sort of, the full swing of science or technology,
right?
It further, and then lots of politics now, dominated by scientific, rationality. These days, we actually watching the platform capitalism, and then pandemic. We would see that the kind of cybernetic technology took over our daily life in these days. So what about your actually the triple O's task, against this situation? That means you actually already clarify your position, and then, but how do you actually locate your triple O within this tradition?
The current tradition of philosophy, you mean, or the existing tradition?
Yeah. After Second World War, actually.
Okay.
Metaphysical comment on the technology and science.
All right. Well, I owe a lot of my position on that to Bruno Latour, since I've worked so closely with him. I also have a long-term interest in Marshall McLuhan. Let's start with politics first. The way I would approach the political question, I wrote about this in my book on Bruno Latour, Reassembling the Political. The spectrum we all use to orient ourselves politically is left and right, right? You meet somebody, you can probably estimate how far left or how right they are on the usual spectrum. And maybe some positions it's hard to pin down as either left wing or right wing, but we have a pretty good idea of where somebody fits when we meet them or talk to them, or where certain politicians fit. Now, of course, the left and right distinction just goes back to the French Revolution. It's not that old. You could maybe argue it goes back a little further implicitly. But what those two share in common is a theory of human nature, that you could pretty safely say the right wing are the people who think that humans are fundamentally dangerous and need to be controlled through force very rigid laws, the continuance of tradition, because without tradition, we're going to fall apart. And you can list some of the classic names from this tradition, Machiavelli, maybe even Hobbes, Schmidt, and so forth. Whereas the left takes the opposite position on human nature, which is that humans are naturally good, we're corrupted by society. If we're not naturally good, we're at least infinitely improvable. The bad things that happen are society's faults rather than the fault of bad human nature. And so the government has a much larger role to play in improving people or helping their station in life. Well, what could render both of those obsolete? I think Latour gets us closer to that than anybody right now by pointing out that human nature isn't necessarily the main question when it comes to politics, because the political sphere is always massively stabilized by inanimate objects. He talks, I've written about this in my book on his politics, that in a way, what makes humans different from animals is that our societies are much more stable. So if you go to watch baboons, like Latour did with Shirley Strum, you're going to find that the baboons are almost in a constant state of crisis about what the pecking order is in the baboon group, who's the alpha male, who's mating with whom. That can change from day to day. And the baboons have to stay close to each other because the social order is very precarious for them. Whereas for us, it's not. It's not that precarious. I mean, this is the most unstable time in American politics in at least 80 years. Nonetheless, I still wake up knowing my name. I know my address. I know how much money I have in the bank. I know my government identification number. I have a driver's license. I know who my wife is. I know my age. I know what things I can and cannot do in society. And all of these have to do with inanimate objects, things like printed degrees, wedding ring, driver's license, a built house that I am the lawful tenant of, printed money, a car that I own, whatever that means. There's a piece of paper that says I'm the owner. No one else can go in and use that car without my permission. So it's really inanimate objects that stabilize us. And of course, now inanimate objects are taking their revenge as the climate is biting back. And so we're going to realize more than ever before that we require a stable, inanimate environment. And so that, in a way, means that the tools that we have, which are either left-wing or right-wing tools for political organization, might not be enough to do the job for environmental degradation. And that doesn't mean we need centrism, right? Because the politics of the future might look left or might look right or might look center. We don't know. It's going to have a different set of coordinates than what we've had up till now. And it's going to have to take a lot of non-human things into account. Carbon dioxide is a political actor now, whether we like it or not. Ice is a political actor. Cows, if we're eating too many cows and they're creating too much methane, we might have to eat fewer cows. Cows are a political actor if we're concerned about the environment. So that's the way I see Triple O entering politically into the contemporary sphere. And again, politics is the thing people get most passionate and opinionated about. So I try not to jump into those discussions quickly, right? It's important, I think, to try to slowly develop a new language for those things. Joff, I saw your hand up.
Interesting.
I have this question, but it might vanish, so I want to get it out. What was I going to say is I wanted to pick up what Chung Mei mentioned about the politics of boundaries, because there is, and then to connect with what Taekwon talked about, the politics, what emerges from your tradition. So I guess my question would be: is there a politics or for Triple O, or is it a mere description of objects? Now that would be something that what Rosie Braidotti one of your critics might bring up, and of course her idea is precisely to think about the politics of boundaries. So I guess one of the criticisms of Triple O is it is a kind of celebration of commodity fetishism of the object. Okay, now whether that's you see like an animus or a magic surrounding the object, maybe you can answer in a moment. But they say that the Triple O is it's essentially conservatism. It's a conservatism because it's concerned with the organization of objects themselves. This is what they say, and therefore you can't derive a kind of ethical imperative from that. They say that from the feminist kind of perspective, that Triple O has no concern with the lives of women and children, okay, and it's not interested in it. It's rather indifferent to difference as such. Now, I really don't buy into that, but it occurred to me this idea of not respecting, of respecting the organization of objects, of society would be an object. So someone like Rosie Braidotti is Deleuzian, okay? And then her argument is, in your tradition, there's a disregard for democracy. And then somehow she connects Triple O with Badiou and Zizek and a kind of Marxist, Leninist authoritarianism, I suppose.
I'd say a couple. You have more to say? I'll wait.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm getting to what I wanted to say, and so the Deleuzian part is concerned with the politics of boundaries. Okay, that's what her argument is. Now, your argument concerning Latour would be that there is no concepts of becoming or the virtual are not relevant. And there's a quotation I dug up a few months ago. You refer to the Deleuzian hooligans, okay, with their concern with the difference and the virtual and so on. So my question is, do you think someone like Rosie Braidotti is a Deleuzian hooligan? Or if not,
Deleuzian hooligan sounds like something I'd say. I don't remember where I said it, but I would have said it in a humorous spirit. I enjoy the Deleuzians. I don't like the idea that somehow flux and becoming is superior to the tradition I work in. But I've got a couple of things to respond to that. The first thing I think is that you can't really graft a politics directly onto an ontology. A good ontology always opens up multiple political possibilities. For example, there's left and right Kantians, left and right Hegelians, left and right Heideggerians. Even Marcuse was a kind of left Heideggerian. And I think when you try to derive a politics too seamlessly from an ontology, like I think Badiou does, for example, I become suspicious, because then I become suspicious that people are simply gravitating to the philosophy because they like the political results. So someone likes hardcore Maoism, so they end up liking Badiou. And a lot of Badiou's followers are like that, right? They also buy into his politics. Whereas people, thank God, are more independent with respect to Heidegger. Most of Heidegger's followers are not Nazis. Most people denounce that part of him. So I think generally the better a philosophy is, the more polar opposite political positions it can generate. Because what it's doing is reorganizing the political coordinates. And so, no, I'm not indifferent to politics. It's just that what interested me was the ontological problem that arises out of Heidegger's tool analysis. And then what happens is you start working on certain problems, those lead you to others. And if you take a political stand prematurely, sometimes you're just going to end up with one of the off-the-shelf versions of politics that are already there, which is what I wanted. I wanted to avoid giving allegiance to any of these groups, and work my own way through the forest as slowly as it takes. As far as commodity fetishism, this is a misunderstanding, and I've actually published an article about this called Object-Oriented Ontology and Commodity Fetishism. Because if you go back and read Marx, what Marx is saying, and this is right at the beginning of Das Kapital, it's not buried, it's the first couple of sections. He says, fetishism means thinking that objects have value in their own right, apart from the social labor that went into producing it. So you don't just have a coat that it has value. You also have a coat that mobilized certain workers in Cambodia who weren't being paid a fair wage, and all these other political things come in when you buy a commodity. But Triple O isn't a theory of value that way. Triple O is an ontology. Marx is not an idealist. Marx does not say nothing exists unless society produces it. In fact, he gives several examples of things that exist that are not commodities. He says water and air in the current state of the economy are not commodities. Anybody can take them. He says bartering, items that are bartered are not commodities. And he says corn rents given as tithes to feudal lords are not commodities. So a certain fairly sophisticated political and economic system has to exist before commodities happen. And if anything, OOO is trying to talk about objects before that, before they get involved in these networks. And so calling OOO a commodity fetishism is just wrong. Now, if people want to call it a fetishism in the sense of thinking that objects are great and objects are wonderful and worth talking about, the only reason I see to oppose that is if one is a complete subjectivist who thinks that humans project everything onto things. Things are just blank screens for humans. And I think that's politically and philosophically a very weak idea. The idea that humans are these almighty positors of everything. And I think that is something that follows from modern philosophy. And I think it's one of the weaknesses of modern philosophy. And I think the environmental crisis is going to force us away from that kind of thing, right? Because even if humans in the Anthropocene are responsible for helping damage the climate includes a lot of things that are outside of human control. For example, maybe some of you read this too. I read the executive summary of the most recent climate report last month or whenever it was. It was fascinating reading. Some things are worse than I thought. Some things are better than I thought. So if you read that report, it gives you a more realistic idea of what, instead of people get into this catastrophism of saying human extinction. Well, we're probably not going to go extinct. It might be something like 80 or 90% of people die, which is bad enough. If you say extinction, in a way, you're exaggerating and not having to face the real problem, which is near extinction. Much more likely to happen. The two things that it said are unlikely to happen now are the South Pole melting and the North Atlantic current stopping and turning Europe into a desert. Those are unlikely. The bad things are that the North Pole and Greenland are going to melt. The permafrost in Siberia and Canada is going to melt. And the sea levels are going to keep rising for thousands of years, even if we stop burning oil today completely. So sea levels are going to rise for hundreds to thousands of years. So the sea level rise is outside of our control. Even if we abolish all industry today, it's going to keep on happening. And certain species are going to go extinct. So I found that very interesting. Reminder of what we can and cannot control. There's going to be at least a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase by 2100. That's the very best case scenario. It could go up to 6. That's the worst case scenario. So I think it's important to look at what the world is telling us about the specifics. When people start talking about extinction, they're focusing too much on the human sense of extravagance and nihilism, right? That everything's going to be gone. Catastrophism, in other words. When people talk about revolution in politics, I have a similar feeling because on the one hand, we tend to think of revolution as a great thing, right? The greedy rich are going to be gone and everyone's going to be equal. But the fact is, capitalism has generated a lot of wealth, and we're going to need a lot of that wealth to fight climate catastrophe. And so abolishing capitalism tomorrow is probably not going to be a helpful solution to the climate problem. Abolishing state authority overnight is probably not going to be the right solution to that either. We need states to be able to do this. Look at how the more authoritarian states in Asia arguably have handled COVID better than the individual democracies of the West. So we may be going into a period where we need a little more authoritarianism. If people can't even put on masks, how can we trust them to follow climate laws? So there may be a reason to keep some of these institutions around for a while. And revolution is a modernist idea that you tear everything down and you start from scratch using ideas, but that's not always the best thing to do. A lot of times things evolve a certain way apart from the ideas that apparently understand them. And sometimes there's an inner logic to that reality develops better than our ideas would develop it sometimes. So sometimes there are things that exist and we may think they seem archaic, but they're a good idea. And sometimes they prove useful later, like using leeches as a medical cure, which was laughable 20 years ago. And now people are doing it again because it's cheap. Maggots eating the dead flesh off of bullet wounds, a medieval cure that people are using again. Lots of other things that seemed anti-modern. This is what Latour is so strong at, pointing out that we never really know what's modern and what's not. Some things that seem very archaic could turn out to be extremely useful in the future. So I'm skeptical of the idea of a revolution, and a large number of people simply take it for granted. We need a revolution. What kind of revolution it's going to be? I'm in the minority there. Now, people say, then you're just a reformist and you're going to keep everything in place and just tinker around the edges. No, because there's something in between those two. Between reform and revolution, there's something I call renovation, which is where you make huge changes to the political sphere without them necessarily being revolutionary ones. You change mid-sized institutions that may be holding us back in ways that we don't realize. You consider possibilities you haven't considered before. Like maybe the reason Black Americans are still struggling is they don't have enough ownership. Maybe we should see to it that Black Americans own more factories. These are not the kinds of solutions that are usually proposed in the American political sphere, because you usually think, oh, everybody's an individual, everybody has the chance to meet their dreams, and so we don't look at structural things. And then the left ends up saying we need to overthrow the entire American government. But that could be highly counterproductive. Not everything about the entire American society is bad. There's some things we probably want to keep. And we don't want the chaos that would probably result from an armed gang taking over, aside from which it's probably going to be a right-wing arms gang to begin with, right? It's not going to be Maoists or permaculturists. It's probably going to be Trump supporters who would be the first to take the United States over with weapons. So I've got a lot at stake in stability here to a certain degree. But then we see things that need major changes, like the status of Black Americans, the status of women in this society, the status of children. You said, Bright, you mentioned children. Yes, children it's time to start asking about more political power for children, who are the ones being most harmed by our deadly climate politics. Shouldn't they at least have a kind of tribune representing them in the Congress, or somebody to listen to the kids? And what's her name? The Swedish girl, Greta
Thunberg.
Thunberg, yeah. She's a great example of a kid who comes out and says things that make a lot of sense, and no one has been saying them among our elected representatives. So I'm glad she's there saying it. So yeah, there's a lot of things we need to rethink. There's a lot of things we need to rethink. I just don't think tearing down the whole society and starting from scratch is the right idea. Architecture, that was a disaster, right? Modern architecture, the reason they backed away from that in the 60s was they ended up having to detonate housing projects 12 years after they were built because they were turning into nests of crime and depression. And so architects had to rethink the modernist project. And I think the same is true of revolution. We need a non-modern approach to significant political change that is not necessarily revolutionary. I'm not sure how much I would disagree with Brydati on political specifics. I tend to support a lot of progressive ideas. I tend to be a liberal in the American context because I think right now, when it's so unstable, we need to hang on to what we have, because we're in danger of losing a lot of what we have, let alone improving anything. So Brydati's probably to the left of me there. And feminism's really in her bailiwick. I have nothing against feminism. I'm not a significant feminist thinker the way she is, and so she's got me there. I don't have any real new ideas about that. Doesn't mean to say that I won't. I don't have any new ideas about physics either, but maybe someday I will, or psychoanalysis. These are all things I'm interested in. So, and the fact that the roles of women in society are so geared towards an economic system that no longer exists, right? And a social system that no longer exists. And yet women are somehow trapped in certain roles that were designed for those systems, right? So there's obviously a lot of things that need to change, children as well. So we've got a lot of changes ahead of us. I'm making the bet that the environmental catastrophe is going to be the leading edge of all this, that's going to be our reality principle. And because of that, we're going to have to rethink a lot of other things. I'm just guessing. It's not a very dangerous guess at this point. A lot of people are saying that.
Well, actually, you said very you're suspicious of a revolution, but I could say, actually, revolution might be a sort of a mechanism of a, object. That means you couldn't actually resist it. As far as actually the concern, I concern that your triple O, you could actually think the revolution like that is a sort of objective mechanism. That is actually delusion then current, contemporary Marxist argue, is a leftist argue, it's not a traditional, Marxism. And then, so, even actually Marx in the 19th century, he emphasized revolution and that kind of, change. Transformation of capitalism is objective, truth. It's not a kind of, actually a subjective, project toward, and what actually happening. So that's I'm actually personally understand actually the revolution. And then that's why just I would say, your triple O could be connected to new idea of revolution. It's not like the old sense of the revolution. We already have that sort of very typical idea, Russian revolution, actually the cultural revolution. But the thing is that we need to repeat, that one, and then picking up that sort of objective mechanism, kind of as already talked about environmental crisis. We can resist it. We cannot resist it. That is exactly revolution. It's coming up, and then. That's why actually connecting to the idea, I think we could say, without, ideal future, without, our expectation of a future, whatever that future will be, realized or not, the politics is always actually related to this, idea of a future. So I think, actually my question was, actually about this one, triple O, what kind of future in triple O think about, or some, it's not really like the good world will come, by this revolution. It doesn't mean that. It's changing, something happen always, and then revolution always happening, and the event always happening. And then what actually could you actually give the answer from the perspective of triple O? That was my question. Yeah.
Well, I'm inclined to see revolutions as ongoing, and they generally take the form of objects. And so media revolutions, I think we've all seen a tremendous change. First of all, social media and smartphones. We've all lived through that. And of course, many of the effects have been bad. Not all of them have been bad. Here we are right now on Zoom. That's a nice thing. We can meet around the world without my having to fly there and burn a lot of, put a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We're able to have these international exchanges. And services like Uber that sprang up out of smartphones. And then, more recently, I think we may be seeing the death of the university as we know it through Zoom and Microsoft Teams and some of these other technologies we've been teaching on. I don't know what you all think about it, but I've been surprised at how well it works. Now, I realize in some fields, like my wife's, she's in the sciences, it's a little harder. But even for that, there's some laboratories you can do online, virtually. In philosophy, I find it perfectly easy to lecture online just as much as I do in person. And since I have here at the Southern California Institute of Architecture in Los Angeles, we have a lot of foreign students. It's actually way better for them. A lot of our students are in China or in Europe and participating from home. And if you think about the amount of money universities have tied up in physical facilities, and the amount that leads to the cost for the students, you could make universities probably much more viable financially by going to a virtual model. And yes, you always lose something, right? You lose the spontaneous encounters in the coffee shop and the conversations that emerge from that. You lose the physical libraries where you're browsing and you find a book randomly. So these technological revolutions always have a downside, but they happen, and they happen because people want them usually. People want smartphones and social media. I wanted email, even though now it makes me miserable because I get much more than I can possibly respond to. And so it makes me feel guilty now that I'm always behind on email and not answering something. You lose privacy, right? People can call you anytime and anywhere, no matter where you are. But these are the kinds of revolutions that I think are very powerful, and maybe more powerful than a bunch of leftist intellectuals sitting around a cafe and plotting to overthrow something that's never going to happen in most cases. So probably a slow crumbling of the existing order and a slow rearrangement of the existing order is our hope, rather than barricades in the street. That's my thought. It hasn't worked in a long time, right? Maybe in a few countries. I lived through the one in Egypt, and it was exciting. I lived through for the first time what people probably felt in May 68 or in the French Revolution, storming of the Bastille. It was exciting. It was so exciting. And it felt so justified. But then the Egyptians get a worse government than they started with. Because it ended up being somewhat theatrical. The revolutionaries were well-meaning, but the army remains the main power in the country. The army wasn't going to give up real power, and the army simply put in a much harsher person than Mubarak ever was. And so I think a lot of Egyptians regret that they didn't just leave Mubarak in. I know that sounds like a conservative thing to say, but sometimes the change does make things worse. I think in the United States, the change would certainly make things worse. I would not trust any revolution in this country right now. It would no doubt be a white supremacist, nativist sort of operation, and we don't need that. We need to become more comfortable with becoming a more diverse society that isn't a white ethno-state, but that is based on the idea of the United States. So my eggs are in the stability basket for now, and then we'll see what happens as the coming years pass. If they don't work fast enough on climate change, then my ideas might change about that. But
all right.
Can I have a quick question?
Yeah.
I think, sure, go ahead.
This is going to be the final one, and it's a very small, very small question.
Sure.
What I was thinking about, your example of while you were discussing objects and its properties, you were saying that the example of a person, you say that I see 76.3% of that person I saw yesterday, sort of like, in order to kind of counter the argument of the bundle of qualities. But I want to take that example. I want to take that example and extend to the question of time. If you say, like a person, like me, if you take me as an object or a subject, I have different temporalities operating in me. It's sort of a heterochrony. Like, my nails grows in a different speed. My hair falls, my hair grays. There are different temporalities operating there, which is connected to some sort of a Deleuzian conception of the virtual or so, right? So I was thinking about the metaphysics of triple O, like when you talk about an object, what could be the metaphysical structure of it? That is one question. Second question is related. When Latour talks about actant, it's like a flat ontology. There is no division, anything, object and subject, all are actants. But in object-oriented ontology, like there is something what you call object-object relation. I think whatever I could gather was you kind of privileged object-object relation to an extent, right? Yeah, or object-subject relation in that sense. And third question would be like your example of Dutch East India Company.
Right.
Could it be called a Deleuzian assemblage in that sense?
Interesting. Let me talk about the first point because it's easier to answer. Yeah, I do strategically privilege object-object relations because it has more shock value. Everyone knows philosophy can talk about subject-object relations, but no one these days, other than Whitehead and his followers maybe, thinks that object-object relations are fair game. They think science does that, right? They don't think there's any possible way without going back to a pre-Kantian dogmatic metaphysics to talk about fire burning cotton. So I like emphasizing that because it shocks people and it wakes them up. But yeah, subject-object relation is also important. And of course, in many ways, it's different from an object-object relation. There's language involved. And because of psychoanalysis, there's probably censorship involved in human perception and so forth. So yeah, humans are different. There needs to be a philosophical anthropology and a philosophical theory of animals. But I feel like I can go a little more slowly on that because modern philosophy has done such a horrible job with that there's not much competition. I mean, what does Heidegger do? Heidegger differentiates between stones, animals, and humans. That's a very boring distinction. That's like what a child would come up with. What about different kinds of animals? Are they really all the same? Is a bacterium the same as an octopus and same as an ape? No, there's have to be big jumps in the animal kingdom too. And there are viruses and fungi. There's lots of other parts of life that we have to worry about. So that's why I focus on object-object. Yes.
On that point, in Latour, the actant you talk about, it's kind of, he takes the concept from the Leibnizian monad, like, a Leibnizian monad without God. So it has a force inside Leibnizian monad. Am I audible?
Leibniz, yeah.
Leibnizian monad.
Leibnizian monad. Yeah, so it has a force inside it. It is not, that monad is not a dumb matter. Like what could object-oriented ontology kind of explain that? Like, how do you say that the object is not a passive thing?
I see. It's not passive in the sense that it is trying to be what it is, right? So it's trying to exert itself. But yes, you're right. There's a certain, Levi Bryant has made this criticism that in my position, all the action really happens in the combination of things. The things themselves don't really change. They are what they are, and they enter into different combinations, and it's in the combinations that new things are created and things happen. So, and actually, I'm willing to defend that. I don't think that first of all, I don't think that there's a smallest level of monads the way Leibniz does. I think there are realities at every level, which is why I say the Dutch East India Company is a real thing against Leibniz. And I say that once the Dutch East India Company is born, it has about a half dozen symbioses, and then it's frozen. And it simply rises and then declines and then dies based on its interaction with the environment. So I would be willing to say that I do have a somewhat passive idea of the object, that it's the object's relations with other objects where the action happens. A thing is what it is and remains what it is. So yeah, I'm willing to pay the price of saying the object itself is somewhat passive. Yes.
Right. So I think, yeah. Manoj, okay?
About the time question, about the time temporality. I think you recently gave a talk on temporality and object-oriented ontology, right?
Yes.
So I would like to know more about that time and.
Yeah. My basic conception is that time is generated by objects. Objects do not exist inside of time. So, the classic debate was between Leibniz and Clarke, of course, Clarke representing Newton, where Clarke and Newton thought time and space are empty containers and things happen inside them. Whereas for Leibniz, time and space are generated by the relations between monads, and that's closer to Einstein's position later. My position is a little different, but it's closer to the Einstein-Leibniz one. It's the idea that objects themselves generate time and space. Time is the tension between an object, a sensual object and its sensual qualities. Space is the tension between the real object and its sensual qualities. And since those are out of joint, we have spacing, that the qualities are not quite in the same place that the object itself is. And time in the sense that the sensual object is not identifiable with any particular set of qualities. That's in motion. And because it's in motion, we have this feeling of time passing. So I am against hypostatizing space or time. I think that objects are where the action happens, and that it's actually on the interior of objects that space and time are generated. And so in a way, that places me on the side of the people in analytic philosophy who say time is not real, like McTaggart from the early 20th century, who says time is not real. And that's how I see it too. I see time as happening once in a while, right? Most of the time what you're getting is you're just getting this surface shifting of qualities. Then once in a while, two objects combine into a new one, or the object splits from its qualities and something happens. Right? And that's when we have advanced into a new era in some minor or major way. And so it follows that time is not a continuum, that time in the sense of the shifting of qualities is a continuum, but time in the sense of historical time happens in jumps. It's discontinuous. And so things do happen that are irreversible. And so this is how I explain what's called time zero, right? People think of this as a paradox. No, I think there's a reason time goes in one direction, which is that if you combine two things to make a new thing, they can't always be separated back into the old components, because an object has a retroactive effect on its old components. Two people get married. Yes, they can always get divorced, but they're not going to be the same people, right? They went through the divorce. They went through a period of marriage. You're not going to come out the other side the same person. So I apply that metaphor to the whole flow of history, as they call it, right? That certain things happen in history that you cannot go back from. You can try to go back from them, but it won't be the same. You can try to recreate an earlier historical era, but it's never going to be quite right.
So I think time has passed too quickly. So I think we need to wrap up, this lecture at the moment. Any guy would, raise some question over? Otherwise, simply wrap up.
I'll have to eat dinner here pretty soon. I'm keeping my wife waiting, I know.
Yeah, I think so. Actually, yeah, thank you for, the joining this lecture, and then the fantastic discussion. And then actually, I hope, that we're gonna see, in person soon. Actually, I want to invite you, Seoul, and then, and Taiwan, India, Kerala or Delhi and Tokyo. I think we hope,
I've been to all 4 of these cities, and I would love to go back to all 4 of them again. So,
of course, yes, of course,
Yeah.
yes. And thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you for all.
Yeah.
Great.
Great.
thank you. I really
Stay
enjoyed it.
safe, stay well.
Thank you very
Graham.
much. Bye.
Keep in touch.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Graham. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Nice meeting you.
Thank you so
Nice
much.
meeting you.
Bye.
Bye. All right. Great, guys.
Great.
Okay, guys.
Yeah, talk later. Bye.
Bye.
Have a lunch. 좋네.